You will remain in your rooms. You will speak to no one. We are done." The words were not shouted. They were delivered with the chilling precision of a surgeon's blade, each one slicing away another layer of Eleanor's reality until nothing remained but a cold, hollow space where her life had been. He did not look at her as he said them. His Grace, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, her husband, stood with his back to her, staring into the heart of a dying fire. The flames cast his broad shoulders into stark relief, a formidable silhouette of judgment and dismissal. She stood in the doorway of his study, the heavy oak a silent witness to her annihilation. The scent of old leather and his particular fragrance of sandalwood and rain hung in the air, an aroma that had once meant safety and now felt like the first breath of the tomb. Her hand, which had been resting on the slight, almost imperceptible swell of her stomach, fell to her side. The joyful news she had come to share curdled on her tongue, turning to ash. He had not asked for an explanation. He had not allowed for a defense. He had simply listened to the silken poison his aunt, Lady Augusta, had poured into his ear for weeks, and he had believed it. He had looked upon a forged letter, a masterpiece of venom and deceit, and accepted it as gospel. He had looked at his wife of 2 years and seen a stranger, a traitor. Eleanor did not cry. The shock was too profound, a cataclysm that occurred deep beneath the surface, shattering foundations she had never realized were so fragile. It was a strange, numbing pressure behind her eyes, a roaring silence in her ears that drowned out the frantic beating of her own heart. She felt a profound and terrifying calm settle over her. It was the calm of the condemned. She had been a duchess for 730 days, a prize he had won, a beautiful and well-bred addition to his ancient line. She had tried to be a good wife, a proper duchess. She ran his houses with quiet efficiency, hosted his suffocating dinners, smiled at the appropriate times, and endured the endless, subtle critiques of a society that weighed and measured her every breath. She had been so certain that with time, with a child, the polite distance between them would dissolve, that the man she had glimpsed on rare occasions, the one with a wry smile and a flicker of warmth in his stormy gray eyes, would emerge more often from behind the ducal mask. She had been a fool. The mask was all there was. The Duke was all there was. Alistair, the man, was a phantom she had invented. "Leave me," he said, the command as cold and final as a closing crypt. She turned without a word. Her slippers made no sound on the thick Persian rug. She walked back through the grand, silent halls of Blackwood Manor, past the portraits of his ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with cold accusation. They were all part of it, part of this edifice of power and pride that had no room for something as messy and inconvenient as the truth. In her rooms, the gilded cage she had inhabited for 2 years, she finally looked at her reflection. The woman who stared back was a stranger, pale, wide-eyed, her dark hair slightly askew. The opulent silk of her evening gown seemed like a costume for a play that had abruptly, brutally ended. Her maid, a young girl named Sarah with kind, worried eyes, helped her undress. Eleanor moved like an automaton, lifting her arms, turning as instructed. The stays of her corset were loosened, and she could suddenly breathe, but the air felt thin and useless. Once she was alone, clad in a simple cotton nightdress, she did not get into the vast, lonely bed. She went to the window and looked out at the rolling parkland of the estate, bathed in the silver light of a full moon. Her land, his land, never hers. She was merely a temporary resident, and her tenancy had been revoked. He had said to remain in her rooms. He had said they were done. He would find a solution. She knew what that meant. A quiet separation. A story concocted for the benefit of the ton. She would be sent away to some remote dower house, a ghost in her own life, while he continued his, unencumbered. And her child? What of her child? A new feeling, sharp and fierce, cut through the numb shock. It was not anger, not yet. It was a primal, protective instinct, a she-wolf snarl deep in her soul. They would not have her child. This baby, this tiny, innocent life growing within her, would not be born into a house of lies. It would not be raised under the shadow of a father who believed it a bastard and a great aunt who was a serpent. No. The word was a silent vow, a single, hard point of certainty in a world that had dissolved into chaos. She moved with a purpose she had not felt in years. Her despair was a fire now, burning away the passive, pleasing woman she had been trained to be. It forged something new in the wreckage, something hard and sharp. She went to a small, rosewood writing desk, a wedding gift from her late father. From a locked drawer, she retrieved a heavy leather purse. Inside was a substantial sum of money, also from her father. "A woman must always have her own coin, Eleanor," he had told her. "Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst." She had thought it a cynical pronouncement at the time. Now it was a lifeline. She pulled a single, sturdy valise from the bottom of her wardrobe and began to pack, not the silks and velvets. She left the jewel-toned gowns hanging like hollowed-out versions of herself. She packed 2 simple dark wool dresses, her most durable stockings, a heavy cloak, and her plainest undergarments. She took a small book of poetry and a miniature of her mother. From her jewelry box she took nothing, not the Blackwood diamonds that felt like chips of ice against her skin, nor the pearls he had given her on their first anniversary. She left them all, glittering coldly in their velvet nests. The only thing she took was a simple gold locket, a gift from her mother, which she fastened around her neck, tucking it beneath the collar of her nightdress. It was a piece of her past, before she became a duchess, before she became this broken thing. Lastly, she went to the vast, cold bed she had been meant to share with him. On his pillow, where his head should have lain, she placed her wedding ring. The heavy band of gold felt alien in her hand, a shackle. She laid it down, a final silent statement. Her escape was surprisingly simple. She wrote a short note to Sarah, enclosing a generous sum of money and telling the girl to return to her family. Then, dressed in the dark cloak, she slipped out through a servant's door. The night was cold, the air crisp with the coming autumn. She did not look back at the grand, imposing manor. It was a mausoleum, and she was fleeing it. She walked for what felt like miles, following a little-used track that led to the tenant farms on the edge of the estate. There, she found the cottage of a man whose wife she had once helped with a difficult birth. She offered him a gold sovereign to take her in his cart to the next town, no questions asked. The farmer, a man of few words, saw the desperation in her eyes and simply nodded. As the cart rumbled away from the lands of the Duke of Blackwood, Eleanor pulled the cloak tighter around herself. Her hand rested on her belly. She was no longer a duchess. She had no name, no home, no future she could see. She had only the money in her purse, the locket around her neck, and the secret she carried within her. It was enough. It had to be. 5 years later, the Duke of Blackwood stood in another study, this one in his London house, and stared at another fire. The 5 years had not been kind. They had carved fine lines around his eyes and mouth, and replaced the arrogance in his posture with a profound, bone-deep weariness. His life, which should have been a triumph, was a hollow echo. His Aunt Augusta had seamlessly taken over the running of his homes, a constant, cloying presence. She filled the silence with chatter and plans, but the silence always returned, heavier than before. It was the silence of a house without laughter, without warmth, the silence of Eleanor's absence. He had told himself it was for the best. He had told himself he had done the only thing a man of his station could do when faced with such a betrayal. But the righteousness of his anger had long since faded, leaving behind a persistent, nagging doubt. He remembered her face in that moment, not guilty, not defiant, just broken, empty. The doubt had become a quiet obsession. A month ago, a chance comment from a dismissed stable hand about the former Duchess's kindness had been the key that unlocked the prison of his certainty. He had begun to pull at the threads of the story Augusta had woven, and it had begun to unravel with terrifying speed. He had hired a man, a Mr. Jones, a discreet and ruthlessly efficient investigator. Jones had worked backward from Eleanor's disappearance. He had found the farmer who had driven her away. He had found the maid, Sarah, now married and living in Bristol, who spoke of the Duchess's profound unhappiness and her certainty that Lady Augusta despised her. Then came the forger, a miserable wretch in a Fleet Street garret who, for a price, confessed to creating the letter that had condemned Eleanor. He described the woman who had hired him. The description matched Lady Augusta perfectly. The betrayal was not Eleanor's. It was his aunt's, and his own. His own pride, his own blindness, had made him a willing accomplice. He had not questioned. He had not investigated. He had simply condemned. The weight of that realization was a physical thing, pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. "Your Grace," Mr. Jones said, his voice pulling Alistair from his reverie. The investigator stood by the desk, a thin file in his hands. He was a small, unassuming man, but his eyes missed nothing. "What have you found?" Alistair's voice was raw. "A trail, Your Grace. A faint one. After she left the coaching inn at Exeter, she seems to have vanished. But a woman of her breeding must live. She had some cash, but it would not last forever. I began checking the pawnbrokers in the towns along the coast." He opened the file and laid several slips of paper on the polished mahogany desk. They were pawn tickets, flimsy, grubby scraps that felt like sacrilege in this opulent room. Alistair picked one up. His hand trembled slightly. The item listed was 1 pair pearl earrings, his first anniversary gift. He felt a wave of nausea. He imagined her, alone, frightened, walking into a dingy shop to sell a piece of her old life for a few pounds to live. The next ticket was for a silver-backed mirror and brush set. The next, a small, enameled music box. Each ticket was a stab of guilt. He saw her shedding her identity, piece by painful piece, reducing her past to a handful of shillings. "She was selling everything," Alistair murmured, his voice thick. "Not everything, Your Grace," Jones corrected softly. "She sold what she could to move on. She was buying passage, food, creating a new life. The trail of tickets moves west, consistently west, along the Cornish coast. The last one is from a shop in Truro. From there, nothing for the past 4 years. It is as if she found what she was looking for. Or she had nothing left to sell," Alistair said, the thought a cold stone in his gut. "Perhaps," Jones allowed. "But the items she pawned were valuable, but impersonal. According to the maid Sarah, the Duchess owned a simple gold locket from her mother. It was never pawned. This suggests she was not in absolute, final desperation. She made choices. She kept what mattered. What mattered? The locket. And what else? What had she valued enough to keep through 5 years of hardship?" "The last ticket is from Truro," Alistair said, his focus sharpening. "Where would she go from there?" "The roads west of Truro lead to the sea, Your Grace, to fishing villages, small isolated communities where a stranger might go unnoticed, especially if she wished to be. Places where people do not ask questions." Alistair looked at the map spread on the wall, a vast, detailed rendering of his country, his home. And somewhere in it, she was hiding from him. He had cast her out, and she had made a world without him. The thought was both devastating and, to his surprise, inspiring. The quiet, biddable girl he had married had possessed a core of steel he had never bothered to see. "Find her, Jones," he said, his voice low and intense. "Search every village, every cove, every miserable hamlet from Truro to Land's End. I do not care what it costs. Find her." "And when I do, Your Grace?" Alistair looked down at the pawn tickets, the sordid chronicle of his failure. "When you do," he said, the words tasting of rust and regret, "you will send word to me. I will go to her myself." He had to. An apology was not enough. An explanation was not enough. He had to stand before her and account for the ruin he had made of her life. He had to look into the eyes of the woman he had wronged and begin the long, impossible work of atonement. The village of Porthgwylan clung to the cliffs of the Cornish coast like a cluster of determined barnacles. Its stone cottages were huddled together against the relentless wind, their slate roofs gray under a perpetually overcast sky. The air smelled of salt, fish, and damp stone. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and stifling ballrooms of London. It was Eleanor's world now. She was no longer Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood. She was Ellen Reed, a widow who worked at the Weary Traveller, the village's only inn. The proprietress, a stout, kind woman named Mrs. Gable, had taken her in 5 years ago, a pale, haunted wraith with little to her name but a small purse and a secret. Mrs. Gable had not asked questions. She had seen the desperation and the steel beneath it, and offered a job in a small room above the kitchens. Now Ellen's hands were no longer soft and pale. They were chapped and capable, familiar with the heft of a bucket of coal, the sting of lye soap, and the rhythm of kneading dough. The fine silks had been replaced by sturdy wool, her complexion weathered by the sea spray. She was thinner, harder, but her eyes, when she looked at her son, held a fierce, unwavering light. Thomas was her heart, walking around outside her body. He was 4 years old, a whirlwind of boundless energy with a mop of dark hair and a smile that could charm the gulls from the sky. He was bright and happy, and knew nothing of dukes or manners or betrayal. He knew only the love of his mother and the gruff affection of the fisherman who saved him the prettiest shells. He also had his father's eyes, a distinctive, stormy gray that was so much a part of Alistair, it was like looking at a ghost. Sometimes, when Thomas looked at her with a particular intensity, her breath would catch. It was a constant, living reminder of the man who had shattered her world, a reminder of a love she had foolishly believed in, and the bitter pain that followed. One blustery afternoon, as Hélène was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the inn, the salty wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face, she heard the sound of an unfamiliar carriage rattling down the cobbled lane. Carriages were a rarity in Porthgwylan. Visitors were few. She paid it little mind, her thoughts on the mending she needed to do that evening. Then she heard a child's cry, "Mama!" Thomas came running from the front of the inn, his small face alight with some 4-year-old's urgent news. He was running too fast, his little legs tangling. He stumbled, falling hard onto the unforgiving cobbles. Ellen's heart leaped into her throat. She dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran towards him. But someone else was closer. A man. A tall, well-dressed stranger who had just alighted from the carriage. He moved with a swift, startling grace, kneeling beside Thomas before Ellen could reach him. "Easy there, little man," the stranger said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. He reached out a hand to help the boy up. Thomas, more surprised than hurt, looked up at the man, and in that moment, Ellen's world stopped for the second time in her life. The stranger froze. His hand hovered, forgotten, in the air. He was staring at Thomas's face, at his eyes. Ellen saw the shock ripple through him, a physical blow that made him recoil as if struck. She knew that face. Older, leaner, etched with a sorrow she had never seen before, but it was him. The dark hair, the strong line of his jaw, the tall, powerful frame. It was Alistair. It was the Duke of Blackwood, here, in her sanctuary. He slowly lifted his gaze from the boy to her. His gray eyes, the very same shade as their son's, were filled with a maelstrom of emotions. Shock, disbelief, and a pain so profound it was like looking into an open wound. The air crackled between them. The wind died down. The gulls fell silent. It was a moment suspended in time, a collision of two worlds that should never have touched again. Ellen found her voice first. It was not the soft, cultured tone of a duchess. It was the flat, hard voice of Ellen Reed, the survivor. "Get away from my son," she said. The words were like stones. He flinched. She reached Thomas, scooping him into her arms, holding him tight against her chest, as if to shield him from the poison of the past. Thomas, sensing the sudden, terrible tension, buried his face in her shoulder. "Eleanor," Alistair breathed, standing slowly. He looked utterly undone. He looked at her, at the rough dress, the chapped hands, the fierce, protective glint in her eyes. He looked like a man seeing a ghost. "That is not my name," she said, her voice shaking with a rage that had been dormant for 5 long years. "My name is Ellen Reed, and you have no business here." "Eleanor, please," he began, taking a step toward her. "I have been looking for you for months. I need to explain." "Explain?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her. "Explain what? That you were a fool? That you were cruel? That you threw me away like so much rubbish based on the word of a jealous old woman? There is nothing to explain, Your Grace. There is only what you did." He stopped, the title hitting him like a physical slap. She was using it as a weapon, a wall between them. "I was a fool," he said, his voice raw. "A blind, arrogant fool. She lied. Augusta lied. I have proof. I know everything." "You know nothing," she shot back, her grip on Thomas tightening. "You know nothing of the past 5 years. Nothing of the cold, the hunger, the fear. You know nothing of raising a child alone, of praying he does not fall ill because you cannot afford a doctor. Your proof means nothing to me. It is 5 years too late." He looked from her furious face to the small boy clinging to her. The reality of it was crashing down on him. A son. He had a son. A 4-year-old boy with his eyes. He had missed everything. The birth, the first steps, the first words. All of it stolen from him by his own monumental failure. "He is my son," Alistair said, the words a statement of dawning, horrifying fact. "No," Ellen said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "He is my son. You forfeited any claim to him on the night you called me a whore and threw me out of my home. Now leave. Leave Porthgwilyn and never come back." She turned her back on him, carrying Thomas toward the inn. Each step was a monumental effort of will. She could feel his eyes on her back, a burning, desperate weight. She could not, would not, let him see her tremble. She could not let him see the tears that were finally, after 5 long years, threatening to fall. She disappeared into the warm, familiar safety of the inn, leaving the Duke of Blackwood standing alone on the cobbled street, a ghost in a life he had destroyed. The wind picked up again, cold and unforgiving, whipping his fine coat around him. He was a world away from everything he knew, and for the first time in his privileged, powerful life, Alistair Beaumont was utterly, hopelessly lost. He did not leave. Eleanor had expected, prayed that he would, that the sting of her rejection would be enough to send him back to his world of empty grandeur. But the next morning he was still there. He had taken a room at the Weary Traveller, her inn, her sanctuary. Mrs. Gable, bless her pragmatic heart, had seen the Duke's finery and the coin he offered, and given him the best room, the one overlooking the harbor. "Seems a man with a powerful sadness about him, Ellen," she'd said, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "And a powerful purse." His presence was a constant, unnerving weight. He did not approach her again. He kept his distance, a tall, solitary figure watching the gray waves crash against the sea wall or staring into his cup in the corner of the common room. But she felt his gaze everywhere. When she swept the floors, when she served the fishermen their morning ale, when she walked with Thomas down to the beach. He was always there, on the periphery, a silent, brooding specter. 2 days after his arrival, another stranger came to Porthgaulan, a small, neat man in a city suit, who looked entirely out of place. He introduced himself to her as Mr. Jones and asked for a private word. Eleanor refused, but Alistair appeared at her side. "Please, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and devoid of its usual command. It was a plea. "Just hear what he has to say, for the truth's sake, not for mine." She looked at his face, at the exhaustion and desperation etched there, and a tiny, treacherous part of her relented. She led them to a small, private parlor, the one reserved for the rare, more genteel guest. She stood with her arms crossed, a fortress of resentment. Thomas was safe with Mrs. Gable. Mr. Jones laid a thin file on the table. He spoke calmly, methodically, his voice a dispassionate drone as he laid out the architecture of Augusta's betrayal. He presented a sworn, signed confession from the forger, detailing the date he was hired and the sum he was paid. He presented statements from 2 former maids Augusta had dismissed, both of whom had overheard her speaking of her desire to be rid of the new Duchess. He presented financial records, showing a large withdrawal from Augusta's personal accounts the week before the forgery was made. It was a cold, irrefutable mountain of facts, a systematic demolition of the lie that had ruined her life. Eleanor listened without expression, but inside, a storm was raging. To see it all laid bare, the calculated cruelty, the sheer malice of it, was sickening. She had known Augusta disliked her, but she had never imagined the depths of her venom. When Jones was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "I have dealt with my aunt," Alistair said into the quiet. "She will not trouble you or anyone, ever again. She has been removed from my house, from society. She will live out her days in quiet obscurity, on a remote estate in the north. Her power is broken." Eleanor said nothing. She looked at the papers, at the proof of her innocence. It should have felt like a vindication. Instead, it just felt empty. It changed nothing. The past 5 years were still gone. Her trust was still shattered. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice flat. "Nothing," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was a shock. "I expect nothing. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to know my son. I only wanted you to have the truth. I could not bear the thought of you living another day believing I was merely cruel, and not also a blind, arrogant fool who was monstrously deceived." She looked at him then, truly looked at him. The arrogance was gone, stripped away. In its place was a humility so profound it was startling. He was not the same man who had condemned her 5 years ago. That man had been broken too. "Thank you for the truth," she said, the words stiff. "You may tell Mr. Jones he can go." She turned and left the room, leaving him standing with his mountain of proof. It was a start, but it was not nearly enough. Alistair stayed. He paid Mrs. Gable for his room a month in advance. He dismissed his carriage and his valet, sending them back to London. He kept only the clothes on his back and a few changes in a valise. And he began to work. It started small. The morning after Jones left, Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window, out in the yard, chopping wood for the inn's fires. He was clumsy at first, his movements stiff and unused to labor. His fine shirt was soon stained with sweat, his gentleman's hands uncalloused and raw. But he did not stop. He worked until there was a neat, towering stack of firewood, enough for a week. The next day he helped the fishermen haul their heavy nets onto the beach, his powerful shoulders straining alongside theirs. He asked for no thanks, no payment. He simply saw a need and filled it. The villagers, at first suspicious of the strange, sad-eyed gentleman, began to watch him with a grudging respect. He fixed the leaky roof over the scullery. He repaired a broken fence in the inn's yard. He did not speak to Eleanor unless it was to ask Mrs. Gable, in her hearing, if there was anything else that needed doing. He was a silent, tireless servant. A duke brought low, performing the tasks of a common laborer in a quiet, relentless act of penance. He was careful with Thomas. He never approached the boy directly. But when Thomas was playing in the common room, Alistair would sit in his corner and read. His voice, deep and resonant, would fill the room with tales of dragons and knights. Thomas, captivated, would inch closer and closer until he was sitting at Alistair's feet, listening with wide-eyed wonder. Eleanor watched it all, her heart a tangled knot of old anger and a new, bewildering tenderness. This was not a performance. A man did not get blisters on his hands for show. A duke did not subject himself to the quiet mockery and grueling labor of a fishing village to prove a point. This was something else. This was atonement. One afternoon, he was returning from the docks, his boots and trousers soaked with seawater. He passed her in the narrow hall of the inn. She was carrying a heavy basket of linens. He stopped, blocking her path. "Allow me," he said, reaching for the basket. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, hot and sharp, shot up her arm. It had been 5 years since he had touched her. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "I can manage," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I know you can," he said softly, his gray eyes holding hers. "You can manage everything. You have proven that. But you should not have to." He took the basket from her, his expression unreadable, and carried it up the stairs. She stood watching him go, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fortress she had built around herself was beginning to crumble, stone by painful stone. Later that week, he found her alone on the beach. The tide was out, and she was searching for sea glass with Thomas, who was running ahead, chasing sandpipers. Alistair approached slowly, as if not to startle a wild creature. He did not speak of London, or his title, or the past. He asked about her life in Porthgwyllen. He asked about Mrs. Gable, about the fishermen, about Thomas's favorite stories. He listened. He truly listened. His entire attention focused on her, a courtesy he had rarely afforded her when she was his duchess. She found herself talking, the words coming in a slow, cautious trickle. She told him of the first winter, the hardest time, when her money had run out and she had been terrified. She told him of Mrs. Gable's kindness, of the simple, hard-won peace she had found in this place. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was her wedding ring. "I found it on the pillow," he said, his voice thick with remembered pain. "I have kept it ever since." He held it out to her. It was not a demand. It was an offering, a piece of their broken past. She looked at the ring, then at his face, at the hope and the fear warring in his eyes. "It is too soon," she whispered. He nodded, his throat working. He did not try to persuade her. He simply closed his hand around the ring and put it back in his pocket. "I will keep it for you," he said, "until it is not." A great, howling storm blew in from the Atlantic a week later. It was a monster of a storm, with winds that shook the sturdy stone in to its foundations, and rain that fell in solid, blinding sheets. In the middle of the night, a cry went up through the village. A section of the old seawall had collapsed, and the tide was rising, threatening to flood the lower cottages. Everyone who was able turned out. Men and women, young and old, worked by the light of swaying lanterns, a desperate line of defense against the fury of the sea. They filled sacks with sand and stone, passing them down a human chain to plug the breach. Alistair was in the thick of it. He worked like a man possessed, his ducal heritage forgotten. He was just another man, his face grim, his body straining against the wind and the weight of the heavy sacks. His fine shirt was torn, his hands were bleeding, but he never faltered. He stood in the churning, knee-deep water, placing the sacks, shouting encouragement to the men beside him. Eleanor worked too, serving hot tea and food to the exhausted villagers, her skirts soaked, the wind tearing at her hair. At one point she saw Alistair stumble, his face pale with exhaustion. Without thinking, she pushed through the crowd to his side, handing him a steaming mug. "You need to rest," she shouted over the roar of the wind. He took the mug, his cold, scraped fingers brushing against hers. He looked at her, his eyes dark with fatigue but clear with a fierce resolve. "Not until it's done," he said. "This is your home. I will not let the sea take it." He meant it. He was not protecting his property. He was protecting her home, their son's home. They fought the sea all night, and by dawn, as the storm began to abate, the makeshift barrier was holding. The lower village was saved. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, the villagers stumbled back to their homes. Eleanor and Alistair returned to the inn. Mrs. Gable had kept the fire in the common room roaring. They stood before it, steaming in the heat, too tired to speak. The silence was different now. It was not the angry, resentful silence of their first days. It was a shared, weary peace. "I believe you," Eleanor said softly, her voice raspy. Alistair turned to look at her. He said nothing, waiting. "When you first came here," she continued, staring into the flames, "I did not believe your story about your aunt. I thought it was just another lie, another way for a powerful man to get what he wanted. But I was wrong. A liar would not have stayed. A liar would not have bled for this village." A tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "I have been so angry for so long. It was a shield. But it is heavy, Alistair. I am so tired of carrying it." He took a hesitant step closer. "Eleanor," he began, his voice cracking, "I'm so sorry. For my pride, for my blindness, for every second of pain I caused you. My life without you has been a desert, an empty, meaningless charade." She finally looked at him. The last of her anger washed away, replaced by a deep, aching sorrow for all the years they had lost. "My life here has been hard," she said, "but it has been real. And I have had Thomas. He is the best of me, and the best of you." Alistair's composure finally broke. A strangled sob escaped him. He knelt before her, not as a duke, but as a broken man. He took her chapped, work-roughened hand in his, and pressed it to his cheek. It was wet with his tears. "Let me earn him," he whispered. "Let me earn you. I will spend the rest of my life making this right, if you will let me." She looked down at the dark head bowed before her, at this proud, powerful man, brought to his knees by regret. She thought of the man who had condemned her, and the man who had just fought the sea for her. They were not the same. Slowly she reached out her other hand and laid it on his head. Her touch was a benediction, an absolution. "Stand up, Alistair," she said softly. He looked up, his face a mask of hope and fear. "Stand up and come home." Their return to Blackwood Manor was not a return to the old ways. It was the beginning of a new foundation, built on the hard-won bedrock of truth and forgiveness. Eleanor was no longer a decorative duchess. She was a partner. Her voice, once silenced, was now heard and respected in every decision concerning the vast estates. She had seen the struggles of the common folk firsthand, and she brought that knowledge to bear. She established a school for the tenants' children. She used the immense Blackwood resources to improve the cottages, ensuring they were warm and dry. She argued for fairer rents and better wages. Alistair, humbled and transformed, supported her in everything, his love and admiration for her growing with every passing day. He was not just atoning, he was learning. He was becoming the man she had once dreamed he could be. The great, oppressive house was filled with light and laughter. Thomas, now officially recognized as the heir, Lord Atherton, took to his new life with the uncomplicated joy of a child. He adored his father, who spent hours with him, teaching him to ride, to fish, to be a good and compassionate man. The ghost of the past was laid to rest by the vibrant presence of the future. One sunny afternoon, months after their return, Alistair found Eleanor in her new sitting room. It was not the formal, stuffy chamber she had once been assigned, but a bright, comfortable space filled with books and her own personal belongings, retrieved from storage and her quiet life in Porthgwylan. She was sitting by the window, a small, open box on her lap. Alistair saw that she was holding something, a tiny, worn leather shoe. "I was just unpacking the last of my things from Porthgwylan," she said, a soft smile playing on her lips. He knelt beside her chair, recognizing the object. He had seen it on her mantelpiece at the inn. "The one thing you did not sell," he murmured. "I pawned everything I could spare," she said, her voice quiet. "My jewels, my silver, the remnants of my old life, they were just things. But this," she stroked the soft, worn leather with her thumb. "This was his first shoe, the first real step he ever took. It was proof that we were moving forward. It was everything." Alistair looked from the shoe to her face, his heart aching with love and a renewed understanding of the strength she possessed. He reached into his pocket and drew out the wedding ring. "Is it time yet?" he asked softly. She looked at him, her eyes shining. She held out her left hand. With infinite care, Alistair slid the ring back onto her finger. It settled into place, a perfect, gleaming circle, a symbol not of ownership, but of a promise renewed, a partnership forged in fire and rebuilt in love. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with all the words they no longer needed to say. It was a kiss of homecoming, of forgiveness, of a future they would build together. Outside, they could hear the sound of Thomas shouting with glee as he chased a butterfly across the lawn. It was the sound of their new life, a life that was real and whole, and finally, truly, theirs.